I'm going to talk about my research projects, the image of the journalist in popular culture, which is USC Annenberg is now the leading university in the world for this subject matter. And you cannot write or research or think about this subject without going through USC Annenberg. And that's what happens around the world. So I'll just give you a brief introduction, then I'll show you a video to show you some of the images of the journalists that we study in film and television. But the question I'm always asked is, why study the image of the journalist in popular culture? And the main reasons are simple. First, journalism itself is supposed to provide us with the stories and information we need in order to govern ourselves. Second, journalists have been ubiquitous characters in popular culture, and those characters are likely to shape people's impressions of the news media at least as much, if not more, than the actual press does. And third, popular culture is a powerful tool for thinking about what journalism is and what journalism should be. I have discovered that studying the image of the journalist in popular culture, starting with the beginning of recorded history, right up to the cyberspace of the 21st century, is an original and fascinating way to study the history of journalism. I must admit I am passionately in love with this subject. When I first started researching the subject 30 years ago, most academics did not consider it a valid field of study. Only a few academics had written on the subject, mostly on the image of the journalist in films. Today, everything has changed. There is worldwide interest in the image of the journalist in popular culture. We have 350 IJPC associates representing almost every academic institution in the world. There are dozens of classes around the world using IJPC materials, and we have a peer review the IJPC journal. The IJPC website, which is ijpc.org, if you want to check it out, and the IJPC database with nearly 95,000 entries on the journalist in film, television, fiction, video games, comics, and every aspect of popular culture are the worldwide resources on the subject. And the center of all of this is where you are, USC Annenberg. Like many things, the IJPC started in tragedy. When my youngest son, David, developed Hodgkin's disease as a senior at Yale and died in 1990, 11 days before his 23rd birthday, I needed a research project to get my mind off the tragedy. I started spending hours in the library studying the subject. 5 years later, I came out of my depression realizing that I had more than 10,000 pages in my computer covering the image of the journalist from modern to ancient times. And so the IJPC was born. What I've discovered is that the public takes its images wherever it sees and hears them. And in the end, it really doesn't matter to the public if these images are real or fantasy, true or false. The reality is that few people ever witness a journalist in action. They rarely visit a newspaper or magazine or internet office or a broadcast newsroom or any place where journalists work to report the news of the day. Yet they have a very specific idea of what a journalist is and what he or she does because they have read about journalists in novels, short stories, and comic books. They have seen them in movies, TV programs, plays, and cartoons. The public bases its impressions and understanding of the news media on these images. One of the dirty little secrets of journalism in the 20th century is the racial and gender discrimination in the white male controlled news media and how this is reflected in the image of the journalist in popular culture. This includes an extensive look at female journalists, people of color journalists, and gay journalists. One of the IJPC's primary objectives is to teach consumers to be more sophisticated in their understanding of the news media, their functions, and the reasons the people have a love-hate relationship with the messengers who bring the important news and information to them. Understanding the real world of journalism as well as that world in popular culture is to understand that the modern news media is controlled by white men writing news for white males. Females have slowly made inroads. Perhaps are more influential in news media today than ever before, but it is still an upwards battle. People of color, ignored by news media throughout the 20th century, are also making gradual inroads, but the progress has been agonizingly slow. Gay journalists, who hid their sexual preference from employers for decades, are now feeling more freedom in revealing who they are and what they have to contribute to the reporting of information to the American people. Without the very important viewpoints from journalists who are not white males, the coverage of news in the United States will never be complete. I'd say those three films are the ones I like to watch the most.
I was wondering, have you looked at how the portrayal of journalists in other countries differs from the US at all?
Yes, the IJPC, it was very funny when I started. I used to talk about American films and foreign films. And then people in Germany, India, China, and Japan would write me letters saying, we don't consider our films foreign. Our films are our country's films. So I changed it to English speaking and non-English speaking films. And if you look in the database, there are thousands of German films, thousands of India films, thousands of Chinese films, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and China. And so we cover the entire spectrum of films throughout the world. And what's interesting is that the image of the journalist, whether it be in Hong Kong films or English films or German films or Italian films or Bollywood, is basically the same. You have the heroic journalist who is working in the public interest, and you have the villains who are not, just trying to use the media for profit.
I was curious what you would think of certain sources that I've heard are also trusted by that demographic, such as the Epoch Times, Breitbart, OAnon, or One American News, Project Veritas, Newsmax, and specific journalists as well, who are within Fox News but are not perceived as the same, such as Tucker Carlson, Maria Bartiromo, Sean Hannity, and Laura Ingraham.
Right. Well, yeah, there's whenever you talk about a group of people, you exaggerate, right? There's always exceptions. And what you just mentioned are exceptions. It is possible to believe in an extreme right agenda and get decent information. There used to be a great conservative movement in this country that I didn't agree with, but they had wonderful thinkers. They had great people. They had people who were thoughtful. They had people like William Buckley and George Wills, and people who were good writers. I didn't have to agree with them, but at least you could have civil discussions with them. You could have an argument with them. And maybe you were right, maybe they were right, maybe neither of you were right. But it was a sane conversation. There's another question. I often hear people refer to journalism as the fourth branch of government. How true do you think this is? Well, that phrase is interesting. The fourth branch of government was developed because when you think of it, we have three branches of government, the federal, the executive, the congressional, and judicial. Who watches them? Who gives the public the information to know what they're doing right or wrong? Who criticizes them when they do something terrible or when they do something that could be criticized? So the press became almost just because nothing else was available as the fourth branch of government to do that. And ever since the country was founded, the press has been looked to alert the public when the executive branch, the judicial branch, or the legislative branch does something wrong, does something that's unseemly. For example, if a congressman comes to vote on a bill and is drunk, or sexually abuses somebody in his employ, or if a justice is caught doing something that isn't what a justice should be doing, or if the president says or does something that is wrong, who will hold these people accountable? But I'm not sure the great bulk of Trump supporters go there. I think the majority of Trump supporters go to Tucker, they go to Hennessy, and they go to Trump. And I think they get a very narrow viewpoint of what the world is like, and unfortunately, in recent years, not a true picture of what's happening. And the other thing that's very disturbing is there's no civil discourse. I mean, you set up this chapter so you could have a civil discussion of issues. Now, if each of you had a total disagreement on an issue, you could discuss it civilly without screaming and beating up on each other. You would just give your viewpoint, he'd give his viewpoint, she'd give her viewpoint, and then you decide, well, what makes sense here? And you don't have to agree, but you're having a good discussion of the issues.
Not the most accurate, but like, what's your most favorite fictional depiction of a journalist?
That's like asking a parent what is their favorite child. They have like 5 of them. It's hard to say. I like the movies of the 30s and the 40s, so I tend to go with a film like Citizen Kane, which is probably one of the greatest films ever made. Any of you who have any cinema class knows that that's on the top list of almost every film critic. It's a brilliant film. I also like a film called His Girl Friday with Cary Grant and Rosalind Russell, which I think does a nice job of capturing the news media in the 1930s. But there's one film that, when people say today, the image of the journalist is the worst it's ever been, I say that's not true. The image of the journalist has always been negative from the days of beginnings of recorded history to tomorrow. And here's the thing. There was a film made in 1930 called 5 Star Final, which is the most devastating portrait of a journalist I have ever seen in my life. It's about a group of tabloid journalists who write a story that ends up in a man and woman committing suicide. And it is a vicious account of what journalism in the 20s and 30s, the jazz tabloid journalism of the 20s and 30s was all about. And when you see this film, it is so moving and so overwhelming on how the press has the power to destroy people.